Hi, I'm Jeff Keim. Do you remember, so I'll be teaching dynamic math to the Death Studios way. This is Entity. This is the first mask I ever produced about 10 years ago. You can see it really doesn't have any wrinkles, and it's kind of an overall core design. I'm showing you this as an example of a first project. You really shouldn't expect fantastic results unless you've had previous sculptural experience. Mask making is like anything else. You should get better and better with each thing you do. Each sculpture should get better, each paint job should get better, etc. I hope you can make good use of the information on this tape, and good luck.
Okay, here's some things you can use to get started. A sculpture stand isn't necessary, but it's useful. I made this one here with 2x4s, a swivel boat seat from Kmart, and a wooden plank. I'm not going to describe how to make a life cast here because the information is available in Richard Corson's Stage Makeup, Tom Savini's Bizarro, and several other books. For sculpture tools, on the left we have thin line tools from Sculpture House. The next ones are some ones I made by hand using pens, some bent banjo string, and a little epoxy glue. The ones on the right are examples of wire loops. You also need several different kinds of brushes, several different lengths, and several different firmnesses for alcoholing the clay. For clay itself, I recommend Roma Plastilina No. 2 from Sculpture House. It's excellent consistency, it's very creamy, very smooth, and overall the best clay you can buy. Before you start, you need to put 2 coats of orange shellac over your life cast. That seals the plaster and stops the oil from the clay soaking in and making the clay too firm. There are 2 basic types of masks. A smaller form-fitting mask that has the eyes cut out, and larger masks that incorporate painted eyes and hidden view slits. I'll actually be sculpting one of the larger masks for the video, but I will show you how to sculpt the eye area for the smaller masks. Okay, for a smaller mask you need to feather the clay down onto the life cast around the eye area, stopping at right about the point where the mask would be cut out. Then you need to build up the clay from there to a thickness of about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. If you'll be sculpting a mask for mass production, it needs to be larger because of latex shrinkage, at least 1 inch in all places. You also need to cover over the eye area with some clay. Even though this is not a sculpted detail, that'll stop the plaster from sticking to your life cast. It's possible to Vaseline this area also, but that could cause some cracking in your plaster of the mold. Okay, next I'll be showing you some examples of eyes in masks. Okay, the first is Vampire. Okay, with his right hidden view slit has white paper stuck behind it, so you can tell where it is. The one on the left does not. Okay, as you notice, the eye is slightly below the hidden view slit. Your eye would be directly behind the hidden view slit, so you naturally need to place the eyes a little bit lower than the eyes in the life cast. Okay, here's another example of hidden view slits. This is Mangler, and he has his hidden view slits hidden in the forehead. You can hide hidden view slits anywhere in a mask. You can see out of the nose, out of the forehead, wherever you want to hide them. These are eye shells. These are the different forms that we'll put into a sculpture, as eyes. The white ones are ultracal. I've taken some different sized globes and balls and stuck those into alternate. Waited for the alternate to set and pop the eyes out, and then you put plaster into it. You need to shellac those firmly before you put it in. Setting an eye onto a sculpture, I'm using a glass eye. I'll pack some clay behind that and place it slightly lower than the eye of the life cast. Your vision hole is going to be between the eye and the forehead. So you need to have the actual center of the eye of the life cast in the deepest part of the crack between the eye and the forehead. Okay, this is just an example. The character that I'll be sculpting here is a larger demon character, but to start with I'm applying clay very thin as if I was sculpting one of the smaller form-fitting masks. Okay, the best way to do that is to apply clay to both sides of the life cast at the same time. If you build up the left nostril, build up the right nostril. That way, everything is going to be proportional and symmetrical, and it's the easiest way to do it. If you sculpt to one side of the mask and then try to match up the other side, a lot of times it doesn't work. Okay, what I've done is I've gotten some of the Roma plastic with some plastic wrap on top of it, put it in the microwave for a couple minutes, and that'll work it up to a real nice, smooth consistency for roughing a sculpture in. You don't want to do it too long because of possible oil burns. Okay, right now I'm just applying just a little bit of clay here and there. You can see like the beginning of a face. If you're actually sculpting one of the smaller form-fitting masks, you still need to sculpt it larger than the intended mask is going to be because of latex shrinkage. Latex will shrink anywhere from 10 to 15%, possibly just a tad more sometimes. Okay, here I've just started to build up a little more. One thing that's also very useful, if you draw, it's definitely a good idea to draw your character in advance. I don't draw well, so I'm basically sculpting this freeform. I'll be doing this type of gargoyle demon character. One of the bad things about sculpting freeform this way is that it usually takes longer because I don't have a 100% clear-cut idea of how the sculpture is going to look. I don't know if it's going to have horns yet. I'll basically wait until it gets to that point and see. Okay, I'm starting to add more clay. As you can tell, it's having a little muzzle there. The original idea for this is kind of a dinosaur type character that has gargoyle aspects to it. Again, this is warm clay that was in the microwave, so you can put a piece on and smooth down the edges with your fingers. You can also put a larger piece on and just smash it down with the palms of your hands. That works very well. Okay, now he's starting to take shape. He doesn't have a large enough muzzle yet. I just basically wanted to get some clay in the back of the head. And periodically what I do is I get what I call a pin tool. They're available from most art stores. It's a long straight pin embedded in a wooden handle. And you can push that into clay to check the depth of the clay. For a larger mass-produced mask like this, I want to go at least an inch overall. I usually go larger than that. If the mask is too large, you can shrink it down by doing an extra generation mold. If the mask is too small, there's nothing you can do really. Okay, here I'm building the muzzle up somewhat. Again, I'm doing it proportional. I'm doing both sides at the same time as much as possible. You can tell the neck area there is very thin, so I'll have to add some more to that. Okay, the sculpture is coming along. I've embedded the eyes just like I did earlier. Started to build up a muzzle. He's starting to come along. Okay, I've decided to put some overlaying fangs on it. The rear fangs really don't work at this point. I'm just sticking a little bit of clay on it to see what I think. Okay, as you can see, I've taken the rear fangs and pointed them up now. At this point in the sculpture, this is when it finally starts to look like something. This is when you really start to design things. At this point, I mean, I can add horns, I can add spines, gills, scales, basically anything I want to. A lot of times it's good to put some of those different things on a sculpture simply to see what works best. If you don't try something, you don't know if it's going to work or not. I'm going to put fairly large ears on it, so what I'm doing is I'm putting a little bit of clay on both sides of the sculpture just to show me where the ears will be. I'm not finishing the ears at this point. I'm just trying to design it as I go so I can tell how the finished character may look. And I've started a nose. One thing that's important is when you're sculpting, as you design like I do, if you do a nose or an eye or whatever, that looks pretty good, but you realize it doesn't fit in with the character, it's very important, no matter how much time you've spent doing that eye, to tear it off and put a new one on. You're not going to want to, but if it's going to help the character, that's the main thing. The finished mask is the main thing. Okay, here I've started a neck waddle, and I'm going to hollow down the bottom part of the chin area. It's a fairly thin character, but he's got quite a few skin folds. Another thing that's important before you actually start is to simply get some clay and some photos of people and sit down and sculpt noses, eyes, whatever, as a practice. If you haven't sculpted before, that's the only way you'll really get a good start. Okay, here I'm doing the back of the neck muscles. He's got fairly thick neck muscles like a dinosaur. I'm adding the clay on in folds as I go. That's one way you can do it. Usually for the face, I sculpt in and add clay on for wrinkles, but here I'm doing it the other way. Okay, characters come along quite a bit here. I've added an awful lot of wrinkles. Photographs. You can get them from National Geographics, or photo files from libraries. This is a book called After 90 by Imogene Cunningham. That's very good. If your local library has it, definitely check it out. Use those as examples of wrinkles. This is a nice little trick on how to match up ears, eyes, and areas like that, is to put a large mirror behind the sculpture and to check out the reverse image. Like in this case, if I wanted to sculpt the left-hand ear, I'd look at the right-hand ear reversed, and that can match it up exactly. This also works well with eye areas, sides of the face, temples, necks, pretty much everything. It's very handy. It's probably the best way to match up ears, definitely. Using calipers to measure parts of the sculpture. This is real handy in finding the correct placement for the ears, how far to set an ear back. You can measure the right ear from the center of the forehead, switch the sculpture around, and make sure it's set back at exactly the same distance. You can also check this for the temples, width of the cheekbones, length of the jaw. Quite a few different areas in the sculpture can be measured with calipers to make sure that it's symmetrical. Real people are not totally symmetrical, so it's not 100% necessary, but you should be close at least. That works for some smaller characters, is that you can embed dental acrylic teeth directly into the clay. As long as you back up the teeth with clay on both sides, underneath, and in between the teeth, where the plaster can't get in and actually lock in, they'll mold just fine. This usually works only for props and smaller characters. The latex of the teeth shrink of the actual mask, so the finished tooth is going to be about 20% smaller. So this really only works for props and smaller characters. Unfortunately, it's not possible to buy super oversized dental acrylic teeth for this purpose. Detailing with the sharp tool. These look real bold now, but this is the way I usually start. Sketching them in, and then we'll alcohol down the edges, pretty much just to see what it looks like. If something doesn't look right, I simply erase it and go back over it again. I'm following the eye pattern of a very old woman from that After 90 book right now. You can make up your own patterns, but it's always a good idea to check against real life. Okay, here's a close-up of what I just did. See, it doesn't look too special now, but once it's alcohol down, it'll look okay. First, some of the largest wrinkles, when the face compresses to make a wrinkle, it sometimes raises up the flesh there. So most of the smaller wrinkles will simply just be sketched in and alcohol down as depressions in the clay. Some of the larger wrinkles will have little worms of clay added over the top. Those will be smoothed down, so they'll be raised up a little bit. So right now I'm finding the wrinkles that I like the best, and that I know that for sure I'll keep, and I'll be adding a little bit of clay on top of that before I start to alcohol. It's best not to be too careful when you do wrinkles. If you're extremely prissy with how you do the wrinkles, making each one perfect, it'll take you forever, and chances are you'll have better results simply by sketching them in how you feel, alcoholing them down, and then any ones that you don't like, erasing. It works much faster that way, and usually better. Your first instincts are usually best in this type of thing. Here I've got a small brush with some rubbing alcohol, 90% or 99% if you can find it. Going over the clay with the brush to smooth it down. As you can see, it looks much more flesh-like already. This is just the sketching in stage. I'm not really expecting to get finished results right here. I'm just putting them in to see how it looks. What I'll do is I'll deepen up anything that I like and refine down the sculpture. Okay, here I'm sketching in some forehead wrinkles. He's not going to have a super detailed forehead. I'm using a sharp, it's called a plaster cleaning tool at this point. You can use a wire loop, you can even use your fingers. The first mask I ever sculpted, I used a nut pick for this type of thing. Basically just use whatever you can. Seeing he's got a mean forehead, most of the wrinkles will V down somewhat. The most important thing about forehead wrinkles is never to make wrinkles exactly parallel. Same way with the sides of the neck, areas like that. Okay, here I'm starting to alcohol it down also. This is just a very rough, sketchy idea, just so I can get an idea what the finished thing may look like. Most wrinkles are broken up into a series of wrinkles, like there'll be a larger wrinkle with 2 or 3 smaller wrinkles coming off of it. In other words, one long wrinkle the entire distance of your forehead you really won't find in real life very much. It'll be like a large wrinkle in the middle and 2 small wrinkles in the sides. Pay attention to as many older people as you can in real life as examples. Okay, here I've added some more detail onto the eye area. I'll be alcoholing that down. And if you try to do this with your fingers, you couldn't get the same detail, and you wouldn't have the same feel for it. And chances are it'd smash the clay down, and you wouldn't get the depth in the bottoms of the wrinkles. Okay, I like most of the wrinkles that I've got so far, so I'll probably leave all the ones I've got. I'll simply, after the alcohol is evaporated out in about 5 minutes, I'll go back in and deepen up some of the better wrinkles. It's best to practice this. The alcoholing down of things is not very easy to explain. Okay, here I'm smoothing down the back of the head. I'm using a large, it's called a stencil brush. You can pick up at most art supply stores. I've got a little jar of alcohol I'm dipping that into, putting it down in a crisscrossing pattern with fairly firm strokes. And it'll take quite a while, but you can get it real smooth. If you add too much alcohol, you'll get almost like a little slime of dissolved clay that'll dry in the mask. If this is the case, the best thing to do is smooth it down as much as you can, then use a towel and dry most of the alcohol off your brush and go back in to pick up that little slime of clay. So texture stamps. We've applied mask latex on top of different objects to give this negative stamp. You can coat latex onto vinyl, concrete, real skin, basically anything that may have an interesting texture. The pieces of clay above the different texture pads give an example of the different textures they give. You would apply these pads on top of the clay and press it down to get those textures. Another way to get a texture is to put plastic wrap on top of your clay, and this is a black stipple sponge that you can get from most makeup suppliers, and we're stamping that on, and gives a real nice texture. You can also do minor sculpting through plastic too. Now I'll get a little close up too so you can see it, because it's a fairly minor texture but very nice. You can go right over wrinkles with that. Okay, the sculpture is basically done. It's got a little more texturing to do, a little refining of wrinkles, and then we're ready for molding. One thing that's very important when you're sculpting is not to ask your parents or your best friend for advice. If you ask them, they'll simply say, "This is great." The best thing to do is ask somebody who can really trust their opinion, and to be truthful, and to be very harsh, judgmental on yourself. It doesn't do you any good for someone to tell you something is great when it's not. Another thing that helps is to stand back from a sculpture several feet so you can take the overall view of the sculpture at the same time. Some sculpture may have very good details, but if the details don't come together, they may have a bad character overall. Another thing that's important before you mold is to put a copyright notice in the back of it. So you circle the year and your name or your company name. That's to protect yourself from copyright infringement. Okay, now we're ready for molding. We're going to be making a water clay or a pottery clay dam across the middle of the sculpture to separate the two mold halves. First, get a can of crystal clear spray by Krylon and give it 2 light coats. Spray it once lightly, let it dry thoroughly, and then give it a second coat. Then you need some water clay. I usually cut it about 3 inches high, 1 inch wide slabs. And you need to conform it to the silhouette of the sculpture and apply it exactly down the center. If it's a little to the front or a little bit to the back, you could lock 1/2 the mold onto the armature for good. Okay, conform it to the silhouette, press against it very lightly. And once it's in place, you very gently squeeze the edge of the clay, and that'll force clay actually onto the sculpture where it'll get in all the little wrinkles, all the little cracks. Don't force it down. If you force it down, it can malform the surface of the sculpture. We're going to be making the back half of the mold first. So what I usually do is get a little bit of water-based clay and put it on the front half of the dam against the sculpture simply to support it. If the dam falls over during molding, it's very hard to correct for. Okay, there I've just applied a little bit to support it. Then get a second piece, apply it on top of that. It'll pretty much stay in place on its own usually. Then there's a little wedge-shaped area between the two pieces. Just get a little bit of water-based clay, force it into that little wedge-shaped area, and later on it'll smooth it down with water. Okay, I'm forcing it down so that there's no gaps between the two. Filling that little wedge-shaped area. Another thing I've done at this point is I've added about an extra 3-inch wide piece of oil-based clay on the bottom of the sculpture, past where the sculpture actually ends, on the armature. That simply gives us like an extra 3 inches to pry with when it comes time to separate the mold halves. You can fit your screwdrivers into that area and pry from there. That'll save any damage on your actual detail area of your mold. If you get any water clay residue on your oil-based sculpture, you can just use a soft brush with a little bit of water and take up any residue. Another thing is that if you accidentally nick the sculpture at this point, it is possible to resculpt through the crystal clear slightly. You can retexture areas and you can basically resculpt areas. It's not a hard coat. Okay, it's about half done. I'm not going to show you the making of the entire thing because the second half is the same as the first, just reversed. Another thing that's important too is that when the dam is completed, is to spray the edge of the dam with Crystal Clear also. When UltraCal 30 plaster hits the water clay of the dam, it sets up very fast unless it's got this coat of Crystal Clear. And when it sets up fast like that, it becomes weak. Another thing that's important too is to make keys in several areas of the dam. Okay, you notice about 4 semicircular depressions in the clay. I've gotten a spoon and I've taken like about a third of a spear out of the clay. Soften that up with a little bit of water on my fingertips. What that does is the back half of the mold will have positive raised globes. The front half of the mold on that same edge will have negative raised globes when it's finished. Those two will lock together and hold the mold exactly in place. Okay, you can put a little bit of water on your fingertips and go over any uneven areas of the dam. Any areas that aren't even could help lock the mold together slightly. At this point, I've also taken some index cards. I've made a cut in that oil-based clay along the bottom, pressed the index cards into that cut, and use some packing tape to tape that together. That's not really necessary. That simply stops your plaster from running off of your mold down onto your armature or your sculpting stand. It's really not necessary to make a dam quite as high as mine. I usually make my molds quite a bit thicker than necessary. Mold break. Most people make their master molds 1 inch to 1.5 inches thick. I usually make mine in the 3-inch thick area. Okay, here I'm taking a soft brush with some water, and I'm taking a little bit of water clay residue off the sculpture. You need that to be dried thoroughly before you start molding also. It's also very important to have the crystal clear coat very dry before you actually start molding. If it's still tacky, that could really severely damage your mold surface. Okay, now we're ready to make a mold. Some of the things you'll need are distilled water. I use Acryl 60, which is UltraCal 30 hardener, UltraCal 30 plaster, a scale, a couple of mixing bowls, a spatula, and a soft brush. The correct mixing proportions for UltraCal 30 are 39 parts water to 100 parts plaster. We're mixing a 1/3 batch here, so that'll equal 13 ounces of water to 33 ounces of plaster. My usual mixing proportions on the water are 1/3 Acryl 60 to 2/3 water for this first coat. Okay, I've got a bowl of UltraCal 30 here that I have taken a flour sifter and sifted quite a bit into it. That removes any foreign particles, any little plaster lumps which occur sometimes. Now I'm sifting the plaster into the water. You sift it side to side. If you get too much of a little island built up in the middle, sift it towards the edges. The temperature of the water should be colder than room temperature. The colder the water, the slower the set. The hotter the water, the faster the set. Once you have the entire 33 ounces of plaster sifted in, you need to let it sit for several minutes for all the water to soak in. If you start to mix it too fast, you'll get lumps, and lumps will mean weak places in your detail coat. It's only necessary to weigh out the first 2 coats. After that, you can just do it by eye. It's really not necessary to use distilled water in some parts of the country. Some parts of the country do have too hard water, though, and that can lead to a uneven mix. It's always good to use distilled water just as a precaution. Once the sifting of the plaster is nearly complete, it's always good to tap your scale too to make sure you're getting an accurate measurement. The first coat for the mold is extremely critical. If there's anything wrong with it, it could lead to a weak mold and a bad surface. If you think that your plaster mix is off, whether it's too thick or too thin, it's always best to scrap it rather than risk damage to your mold. Okay, now we'll leave this in a couple minutes for everything to soak in. This is what the plaster looks like as it's set. It's a little kind of dried mud lake effect on the top. That's natural. Now we'll gently stir it together. I usually work the side against the side of the bowl just to make sure if any lumps are there that they'll be smashed out and mixed in thoroughly. You want to mix it thoroughly, but you don't want to really whip it up too much. If you really whip it, that'll stir air into the mix, and that'll cause air bubbles in the mold. Okay, the detail coat is applied with a soft brush. It's not really necessary to be real careful with this first coat to start with, because we'll be blowing out all the air bubbles with an airbrush. I usually use about 45 to 50 pounds of air pressure for this. Okay, we're more or less going to cover the back of the sculpture as much as we can, as fast as we can too, so it doesn't start to set up. It's a good idea to get some plastic wrap and cover the front of the sculpture just in case some plaster would make its way to the front. It's a lot easier than trying to clean it up later. I'm not really worrying about getting in the wrinkles yet because the air pressure will do that for me. You don't want to get too much on either, because that will weaken the index cards in the bottom of the mold. Okay, here I'm using my airbrush. I'm popping all the air bubbles and forcing plaster into the cracks and wrinkles. It'll splatter too, so be careful of any walls in the background. And just spread it around. If you spray it too much, that'll dry out your plaster. If you dry out the plaster with the air pressure, what that'll do is that'll actually cause it to dry prematurely, and that'll cause for a very weak mold surface. Okay, we've gotten rid of all the air bubbles. I'm going to get the soft brush and more or less pat on extra plaster. Once the detail surface has been put on, you don't want to overbrush it. If you overbrush it, that can disturb the lower layer. Likewise, you can have plaster running down, but you don't want a lot of it running down. If you pour it on top and leave it run down, that can cause problems also. You want to get as much built up as you possibly can safely. The thicker the detail coat is, the better it is. I'm not really worrying about getting too much plaster on the mold dam at this point. The mold dam is not a necessary surface. I'm just worried about the surface against the clay right now. Okay, we blew it out a second time for any air bubbles. It's especially necessary to make sure that you blow out the ears every time. Just patting on some extra to add a little bit of extra thickness, and it's just about done. Okay, now I've let the first coat set up. I can't tell you an exact time. You basically have to do this by eye. It should be set up enough to the point where it's lost its sheen, but not too dry. If you leave it too dry, the dry plaster from the detail coat will suck up water from the second coat, and that'll create a uneven bond. So it should be just recently have lost its sheen. Also, you can tap the thickest part of the mold, usually the toppest part, the topmost part, and if your finger disturbs the plaster, you realize it's not quite ready. Now for this coat also, I'm patting it on, I'm not brushing it on. If I severely brush this, what will happen is the water from the plaster will kind of dissolve the first coat and brush into it, which will weaken it a lot. I'm just going to pat it on. I also use the airbrush to force plaster in the cracks of this coat also. The first and second coat are really the only critical coats. The other coats beyond that are simply to reinforce those two coats. The first coat is critical to get a nice even mixture, so you have a nice hard surface. The second coat is it's just critical because it's possible to disturb the first coat. I'm adding a little bit of plaster to the dam now. It's not really necessary, but I've got some extra plaster, so. It's also best to work from the top down usually. At this point, if I flooded the area with too much ultracal, simply the fact of it running down could also dissolve the first coat and cause it to be weakened. It's very necessary to blow out the ears with the air pressure with this coat too. The first coat will suck water out of the second coat to make it thicken up a little faster. And if plaster is dripping down into the ears, you could have a big air pocket. What will happen is when you're cleaning the mold out later on, that very thin skin of the first detail coat will break, causing a very large air pocket in the ears, which will have to be corrected on the master copy. Any corrections that you do may appear as a defect. Okay, the second coat is dry, so I'm adding a third coat now. As you notice, I'm not being as careful this time. You can brush it on more. I'm applying it faster. I've also mixed more plaster this time. I've also used warm water this time too. The warm water will make it set up faster. The making it set up faster isn't really necessary, but it makes the mold making time less. With this coat too, as the last little bit of plaster goes on, it's going to be a little thicker. You can add some extra bulk to the top of the head. The top of the head is where all the weight from the mold rests when you're casting it, so I usually make the top of the head quite a bit thicker. It's also necessary to make the dam edges very thick too. You'll be prying on that with screwdrivers later, so you want to make sure it's very strong in that area. Otherwise, your mold could crack. Again, we're being very careful with the ears at this point. While this coat is drying, I'll be cutting up some burlap strips. We use burlap for the 4th, 5th, and 6th coats to reinforce the mold. If you have molding burlap, that's a very loose weave burlap. That's very good. The burlap that I'm using here is regular burlap bags cut into strips about 2 inches wide and maybe 4 or 5 inches long. You dip the burlap into the plaster, let it soak for a couple seconds. Don't wring it out or anything. Put it on sopping wet. Position it carefully and hold it for just a second to make sure it doesn't start to run down the sculpture. In this coat, I generally try to add some burlap to the shoulders, the back of the neck, top of the head. I don't try to do too awful much on the side of the head or the very back of the head, because it'll have tendency to fall off at this point. You want to get a couple layers of burlap over the entire thing by the time the mold's finished, though. If you have burlap over most of the sculpture but not all of it, that'll cause a weak point and the mold could break at that point. It's also very important right now not to put burlap around the ears or around any of the detail areas like the deep wrinkles on the back of the neck. It's possible to have a bad air gap if you try that. And also that could break later, causing a defect. Right now I did place them over some of the neck wrinkles. If it is possible, if they're built up enough, if the deepest part of the wrinkle is filled in. Okay, as you notice, I'm holding it in place for the plaster to set just a tad, so it doesn't fall off. Okay, I've let it dry, and for this coat, I'm brushing it on first. It's not really necessary, but I usually like to brush it on first just to make sure plaster gets in all the little cracks caused by the burlap. If you have too many air pockets here and there, that'll also cause weakening. I've also let the plaster thicken up more this time too, so it'll basically stay where I put it more. I'm going to build up quite a bit of burlap on the mold dam area. Like I said, that should be a very strong point. Well, I'm going to try to cover around the ears as much as possible this time, so I can possibly put burlap on next coat. Okay, I've put some extra burlap on. I've got just about the whole thing covered except for the ears. So it's always good to have like a 2-inch wide spatula around too, because as the plaster starts to thicken up, you can use the 2-inch wide spatula to get in some areas that you can't get it in normally, like around the ears, under the ears, areas like that. Dipping the burlap into the plaster will make it set up a little faster also, because the burlap will suck water out of the plaster, making it thicker. Okay, this coat has set too long. In other words, it's lost its sheen, and for some reason or another, I couldn't get to it right away. So what I'm doing is I've got a spray bottle filled with water, and I'm spritzing the entire mold area with water. What that'll do is that'll soak up into it, and that'll create a better bond. If the plaster is too dried out, fresh plaster will not stick to it well. And it's possible when you're taking the mold apart for simply the back half to come off in sheets. Okay, I've added another coat. The coat is almost set up, so I'm spraying the whole mold with water again. This time I'm spraying it down with water and using my hands to soften up all the little points in the mold. It's not real necessary, but it makes for a nicer looking mold. And when you're casting it, you're not going to end up tearing your skin up with it. I'm pushing down any little bits of burlap that show through too. Okay, the back half of the mold's completed, so we've laid the sculpture down on its back. I've started to take off the clay dam with sculpture tools. And the way you do this is you start to lift up as much as possible. I usually cut in with some big wire loops. And once you get close to it, you pry up the edge of the water clay and very gently pull it away from the sculpture. Don't use a tool at this point because you could end up damaging your sculpture. You very gently pull it away. If there's any water clay residue on the sculpture, you can take it off with a soft brush and water. If there's too much residue and you end up soaking the area with water, use a dry brush or some paper towel to soak up the water, because extra water in there when you make mold is not good. But make sure you get all the water clay off. Dissolve it off with a brush if you have to, your fingertips or whatever. If you have any air pockets in here too, in the mold dam area, you can add a little bit of water clay or oil-based clay to the air pockets. If you have a large air pocket, plaster from the from the front half of the mold will soak into that and lock together. Now I'm dissolving off some of the clay residue. At this point too, it's a good idea to start to spray the front half too, so that can be drying up thoroughly before you're ready to start the front half. It's very necessary to really make sure that the eyes are gotten good with spray also. Okay, I've added a coat of spray. And now I've got a jar of Vaseline and a brush, and I'm applying Vaseline to the entire mold dam area. If you don't do this, you don't have a two-piece mold, you have a one-piece mold, and you'll never get it apart. So really soak the area quite a bit with Vaseline. Use a pointed brush so you can get right down next to the sculpture. If you get a little bit of Vaseline on the sculpture, you can always Dremel that off of your finished master copy. To the right next to the sculpture that's not covered, what will happen is your detail area will actually shatter there when you take the mold apart. This part is very critical. If you forget this part, you're in trouble. If you don't cover all of it, if you don't cover all of it well, you'll also be in trouble. I've also pressed some clay onto the armature at the top too, so I've got a little extra prying room. Hitting a second coat with the crystal clear. And as I mentioned before, you let it dry very well, otherwise your detail coat could be ruined. Okay, now I've taken some thin strips of oil-based clay and applied it in about 4 or 5 different parts on the mold dam. These should be the width of a screwdriver or wider. What these will be for is that when the mold's completed, I'll stick a screwdriver into these areas, into the clay, and use those areas to pry the mold apart. When you do this, you should make sure that the clay comes out past the edge of the mold. You should also make sure that it's at least a ½ inch or maybe even 3/4 of an inch away from the sculpture, so when you do pry the mold apart, your screwdriver does not shatter your detail coat. Okay, I've mixed a batch of plaster again using 1/3 acryl 60 in the water, 2/3 distilled water. I'm applying it just as before, applying it very fast. The reason why we do the back half of the mold first and the front half second is because when you're laying the sculpture down like this, you can get plaster into the eye sockets, into a deep mouth or deep nostrils much easier. If you do it the other way, where the front half is resting up, you could get major air pockets in the nostrils and mouth and eyes. I'm just patting it over all very fast. I'll blow it out as I did in the first coat. Excuse me, on the first half. One thing that's different with doing this, with doing the second half of the mold, is you want to make sure you don't have too much plaster run off of the dam area and locking onto the back half. If this happens when it starts to set up a little bit, use a soft spatula and take off the excess plaster there. It's also possible to get some plastic wrap and put some plastic wrap against that edge also to stop excess plaster from locking it together. Now that I've blown it out, I'm adding a little bit. I'm filling in some nostrils in the mouth area right away. As you notice too, seeing it's laying down, instead of really patting it on, I'm more or less splattering it on. That way you'll make sure that there's no air bubbles. It's usually possible to get a thicker first coat on the second half than it is on the first half because of it laying down like this. And blow out this extra coat here too with air pressure if it needs it. Seeing I've splattered most of it on, it looks pretty good. I'm blowing it out with my breath wherever it needs it. Okay, the first coat is set up, and we're adding a second coat. Again, I'm more or less splattering it on to begin with. That way we don't have to worry about the brush upsetting the first coat. Just going to splatter it overall, and then blow it out with the airbrush again. Again, we're using colder water for this coat, so it sets up slower. Okay, now I'm just splattering on some extra. Okay, the second coat's dry, and I'm doing a third coat. I'm patting it on just like I did before. Especially careful of those deep wrinkles along the side of the neck. Those would be prime candidates for air bubbles. Some of the mouth, so I'm filling that in as much as I can, as fast as I can. Okay, I believe this is the fourth coat here. And we're just spreading on fast because you don't have to really worry about upsetting it. I believe this is the fifth coat. I've mixed quite a bit more plaster because we'll be adding a lot of burlap this time. Now the mold's done. I've skipped the sixth coat here simply because it's repetitious. Right now I'm sticking my screwdrivers into those little clay slots that I made. Screwdrivers on both sides and pressing up. It's best to get the mold separated all along the edge. I usually start at the top, work down, then put a screwdriver between the armature and the front of the mold. And usually you can rock it back and forth, and that'll work some air in between. Okay, it's ready to come off. For the back of the mold, turn the mold over so we can get to the area between the armature and the mold. Put some screwdrivers in there. Usually the back half comes off first if you try to separate the mold while it's sitting upright. That's why I do while it's laying down, because the front half is harder. That way we can take the front half off. Made a cut in the clay there, simply so it'd come off easier. Okay, now we're going to take the clay out of the mold as soon as possible. Just peeling it off with my fingers, for the most part. You can use wire loops where necessary. If you use your fingers for most of it, though, you don't have to worry about any breakage of little detail parts. And taking off the eyes real careful so I don't break anything. I usually separate the mold while the mold is still warm. Some people suggest waiting till the next day, but if you separate the mold while it's still warm, the clay is also still warm and it comes off a little easier. Here I'm very carefully cutting into the clay with some loops in the deepest part, cutting in the center part. That way I can pry the edges of both sides away easier with my fingers. You can use your small tools like your thin line tools from Sculpture House. You can use those for the little detail areas where it needs it. It's also necessary to clean the mold dam part too, as much as possible with soft cloths to make sure there's no plaster residue or Vaseline residue. Here I've got a thin line tool, and I'm taking clay out of the ears. Basically, the best way to do that is to hollow out the middle of the ear and then try to work the clay away from the sides with the small tool. Now I'm cleaning off that mold edge. Any clay that's been smeared onto the mold area can be taken off with alcohol or acetone also. Alcohol will soften it up to where it can be taken off. Acetone will dissolve any of the clear coat spray that may come off. Crystal clear sometimes comes off on the mold area, and that will make a very thin spot on your master copy. Right now I'm using alcohol to dissolve the clay. You can use a soft cloth to pick that up also. And you can usually tell where there's crystal clear spray embedded in the plaster by a shinier area. And I usually use a denture brush for that and a little bit of acetone. And very, very gently rub it. If you get little pools of the acetone built up, it's a good idea to get a soft cloth and to dab that out, because otherwise what will happen is the plastic will simply dry back onto that area. Acetone is very flammable, so don't smoke around it. Okay, here I've poured latex into the front half of the mold once it was cleaned, and very thin coat, and just peel it out. That way, if there's any little clay pieces left, those will come off on in the latex. And you can also tell by looking at it if there's any clay residue still in there that you don't know about, like in a detail area such as the mouth or teeth or eyes. Okay, we're ready to put the mold together now. It's been thoroughly cleaned. I've got a what I call a ratchet strap. It's a packing strap. It's nylon. It's got a ratchet attached, so you can crank it down to about 300 pounds of pressure, I believe. Put the molds together. Feel on the inside just to make sure that the seam is very tight, that the edges meet up very well. Put the strap around the mold and start to crank it down. It's possible, instead of using the strap, to use plaster bandages or things like that, but the ratchet strap will really do a better job for you. It's best to have the ratchet strap not on the seam line too, because you'll be covering the seam line up with plaster later, and you don't want plaster in your ratchet strap, because that'll lock it up. Okay, crank it up fairly tight, and then feel on the inside again, just to make sure that the cranking of the ratchet strap hasn't shifted the mold at all. If the mold edges still feel like they're meeting very well, go ahead and crank it up as tight as you can comfortably. Then mix up some plaster, and I usually put it on with the spatula. I put it on the outside of the mold seam. That'll stop latex from trying to leak out while you're casting it. I usually use 2 coats just in case there's a little air pocket or anything. It's always a good idea when you're casting a master copy to keep a little bit of oil-based clay around, just in case. If latex starts to come out of the seam line, you can slap a little bit of oil-based clay over that gap and stop it from leaking that way. You want to be real careful not to get any plaster on the inside of the mold. It's usually a good idea to keep some plastic on the inside of the mold to make sure it doesn't leak. Okay, the outside's sealed. Now I'm going to seal the inside of the mold seam. I've mixed a very small amount of Ultracal 30, fairly thin. I've got what's known as a baby ear syringe. It's a small plastic bulb, and you fill the bulb with the Ultracal 30, and you very gently put just a couple drops at a time along the mold seam. Take off any excess with your finger and wipe your finger off on a wet cloth. If you miss any spot, that'll end up as a defect in your master copy. It's not really necessary to do this, but it ends up for a cleaner looking master copy. Continue doing this over the whole surface. If your mold line runs through your ears, it's really impossible to get into that. So do the entire mold seam except for the ears, if that's the case. We're ready to cast our master copy. I've lightly spritzed the inside of the mold with a little bit of water. That helps clean this over the whole surface. If your mold line runs through your ears, it's really impossible to get into that. So do the entire mold seam except for the ears, if that's the case. We're ready to cast our master copy. I've lightly spritzed the inside of the mold with a little bit of water. That helps cut down on air bubbles. I waited for most of it to dry out. I usually put the mold on top of a bucket simply to save a little back strain. You have to make sure that it's not going to fall over. I'm filling it with R&D 407 latex. Filling it up to the top. Going to splash a little around on the neck just to make sure all the bits are covered. Then I will immediately pour it right back out. I usually cast my master copies in several coats just to make sure you get a nice even thickness overall. A lot of times if there's any plastic residue from the crystal clear, you'll get very bad thin spots. If you pour it in these coats, you get a nice even thickness overall. Okay, now we're going to pour it out, let it drain for a minute. Then I'm going to use an airbrush with about 50 pounds of air pressure to pop all the air bubbles on the inside. This master mold weighs probably 50 to 60 pounds at least, plus the weight of the latex. It's important to keep any materials you may need right there. If you notice, I've got my airbrush tucked in my belt loop, or my pants pocket, so it's right there. Okay, now I'm taking the airbrush. Sticking inside, I'm going to pop all the air bubbles and move the latex around as much as possible to make sure that there's no air bubbles inside. You definitely need to take more attention with the nose, mouth, eyes, and ears. Also, the chin is a trouble spot also. If you have a mask that has a down-pointed chin, you may want to rock the mold just a little bit further ahead than I did. Latex has air bubbles inside of it. Those air bubbles will rise if it has a very downward pointed chin, and if you have it basically level, air bubbles will be trapped there. Okay, when I'm moving the airbrush around inside, I'm trying to get rid of the air bubbles, but I'm not drying the latex up. If the latex seems to be drying a tad, or seems to be gelling, I'll pull the airbrush out right away. If you use too much air pressure, or if you dry the latex out too much, it'll start to gel, it'll start to peel away from the mold. Okay, when all the air bubbles are done, are popped, I'll pour it back full of our RD407. I'll leave it sit for about 15 minutes or so for this first coat. If you're going to be trying to do a one-coat master copy, you'd probably let it sit in for about 2 hours or so. When it's full up as far as I can, I'll grab a spoon and splash some latex up on the neck area, because usually you can't fill it up quite all the way. Mask latex has quite a bit of ammonia in it. If you'll be using quite a bit of it, it's a good idea to use a respirator with an organic vapor filter. Okay, now I'm pouring the latex out. When you do this, it's important not to let any little plaster chips from the mold fall into the latex. What happens then is plaster will suck water out of the latex and create little latex rocks. A very small plaster chip will actually create a rock the size of a dime or so. Okay, I'm resting it against the wall there to drain. Make real sure that it's set there. Okay, now after a few minutes, I've tipped it back down, mouth down. Okay, that's to let it drain. Then I put it on its side after about half an hour or so, and occasionally rock it back and forth from one side to the other, like maybe every 15 minutes or so, change the position of it. That's to stop latex from pooling up in the chin or the ears or whatever. If you have a pooled up area, it will not dry there. Okay, this is a shot of the latex. Okay, this latex is set for about 4 hours or so, and it started to gel. Okay, once it starts to gel, you can pour a second coat in. I'm pouring it very lightly, not to disturb the lower coat. I usually fill it about half full or so. Then when I pick it up, I'll swish it around to make sure all the surfaces are covered. I usually cast my master copies in about 4 coats. That gives a good thickness and real good overall coverage. Okay, the master copy is just about dry. It's had 4 coats. I usually use an old-fashioned hair dryer that has a cool setting. Heat shrinks latex. If you use one of the old-fashioned hair dryers with the cool setting, you can circulate the air so the mask will dry without shrinking it. You can usually tell when the master copy is ready to pull because the latex will start to pull away from the sides of the mold. If you use heat, this will happen very fast. You want to make sure that the ears are pulling away also. Okay, I'm very gently getting my hand inside between the mold and the latex, pulling it away. If you try to pull it too fast, you could tear it. Dried latex that's still in the mold will still be very flexible and will be very weak at this stage. Once it actually cures and dries, it'll be extremely tough. I usually pack my master copies full of plastic bags. It doesn't sound very professional, but it really works well. If you use newspaper, you can get little bumps that'll appear. You need to position the mask perfectly, exactly how the sculpture looked. Latex has a memory. When it dries, if the mask is malformed in any way, it'll stay in that malformed position forever. So here I am making sure it's positioned exactly perfect. Making sure that the plastic bags haven't ballooned out the temples or the cheeks or any of those areas. At this point, you'll really need to let the latex master copy sit for. Okay, I'm taking a little bit of the seam off. Latex has gone down through the little plaster area that I put in the seam line in a few places. Then you need to take the seam line off with the Dremel motor tool. Okay, you can use one of the stone tips, one of the felt polishing tips. I'm using a felt polishing tip here. This takes quite a bit of practice. You want to take it down to the mask surface, but not bite into it. It takes a light hand for this. Definitely practice before you actually start on a good master copy. Practice on some scrap latex or whatever. If it digs down into it, you'll basically have to stipple over that area with latex to build it up. Here I've got another stencil brush. I'm scraping off all the little shavings from the drumming. Yeah, there's little dust-like latex particles that'll settle on the mask. Once it's all brushed off, I'll get a little bit of mask latex, stipple it on with the sponge. That'll seal that and make it really not show up as much. The Dremel area would not have any texture normally, so this will add the texture to make it match the mask as much as possible. I'm dremeling out about 2 inches or so on either side of the dremeling line. Now we're ready to make a one-piece copy mold. I can't really show the procedure because of time, but it's basically the same exact thing as a master mold, except for this will be done in one piece. You position the master copy firmly on the stand that's not going to fall over. Spray the thing with two coats of crystal clear. Wait for those to dry. Mix a batch of UltraCal 30, just like you did for the detail coat of the master copy. Brush it over all, spray it out, and pat some extra on. Wait for that to dry, and mix up a second coat. Build it up about 5 coats or so, adding burlap to the third, fourth, and fifth coat. And basically, it's the same exact thing as a master mold, except for it's done in one piece. When the mold is dry, you simply pull the mask away from the mold and pull it out of the neck. Here we're ready to cast a completed copy mold. One thing that's important is I pour my molds full of water first. If you don't do this, a mold can get dried out, and if it gets dried out, it sucks water out of the plaster and traps little tiny air bubbles, so I have a very spongy surface. If you pour it full of water first, what happens is the plaster isn't that dry and will not make all the little tiny air bubbles. It's not necessary. Some people don't do this, but you can give it a try and see if you like it. Okay, now I'll let it sit for about a minute or two for most of the water to soak in. You want to cast it when it's just losing its shine. In other words, most of the water is soaked up into the plaster, but it's still damp. Now I'm pouring in RD407 latex. I fill it most of the way to the top. I'll swirl it around a little bit as I pour it out to make sure all the surface is covered. Let it drain for 15 seconds or so. Then I'll use the airbrush again to pop all the air bubbles just like I did with the master copy. Again, be careful of the chin, the nose, any teeth, eyes, and ears. To make sure all the air bubbles are out of that. Also, if your mask has a down-pointed chin, you'll want to rock the mold just a little bit more forward than usual, so air bubbles will have a chance to escape. Again, you want to make sure you don't dry out the latex too much. Just pop the air bubbles, swirl the latex around a little bit as you do it, and then pour latex back in. When you do pour the latex back in, you need to rock the mold or vibrate the mold somewhat. That'll cause any air bubbles that are trapped to loosen up and work its way to the surface. Mask latex builds up a thickness according to time. If you let it sit for an hour, you'll have like an average non-post mask coat. If you let it sit for 2 hours, it'll be basically double that. It levels off at 2 hours. If you leave it sit 3 hours, it's not going to be 3 times the thickness of a 1 hour coat, but still it will get slightly thicker after 2 hours. My average time for pour is about 2.5 hours. Okay, after 2.5 hours, I'm pouring the latex back out. Again, I'm being careful not to get any plaster chips in the bucket at that time. And we're gonna leave it sit for about 15 minutes or so to drain. Okay, this mask has drained and it's dried for about 24 hours. It started to pull away from the side of the mold, so I know it's dry. Now I'm just peeling the latex away from the edges. And if a mask doesn't have any thin ears or any large features, you can actually get it out simply by shaking it. When you shake it, most of the features will pull away from the mold. You need to fluff it back out to its original position, to where it looks natural, and stuff it full of either plastic or newspapers. Again, latex has a memory, so if it's malformed in any way, that malformation will stay in the mask forever. Okay, I position this stuck into 2x4s. Another way you can do it is you can hang it upside down. I've got basically clothesline run across the studio. You can hang them upside down. They'll have a chance to cure. They're positioned very naturally, and it's a good way to store a lot of masks. You need to let this copy of Cool Blue has cured for 2 days, so it's ready to be trimmed. I use X-Acto blades. X-Acto blades are packed with a light spring of oil on top of them to stop them from rusting. You'll need to wipe this off because oil will attack latex and actually make it rot. The easiest way to trim is to lay the blade as flat down as possible. If you try to use the blade at a 90-degree angle from the mask, you'll get like a sawtooth effect. I put the tip in, lay the blade down as flat as possible, and push it. This also takes a lot of practice. It's not anywhere near as easy as it looks. Okay, for like a large cut, I usually start in the center, work to the left side, start in the center on the top, work to the left side. Then I'll grab the little piece of latex that's been cut out and hold that so there's some tension. That also helps quite a bit. If the mask is flopping around on you, you're going to get a very jagged edge. Also, practice on scrap latex for this because this really is an art. You'll need to make sure that you have enough holes cut for adequate breathing, 2 or 3 holes at least. Okay, this is a little air bubble in the air. I've got a little plastic squeeze bottle filled with latex, and you can put a little drop of latex on that, so that'll look good. Also, you can use a little bit of latex on a pin for small air bubbles. Okay, on the left we have RD689E, which is a clear latex paint base made by R&D Latex. On the right we have different forms of pigments they can pick up at most paint stores. You can buy them by the pint, quart, or even by the ounce. Most paint stores have a carousel where you can buy them by the ounce for about 75 cents an ounce or so. Okay, for mixing a base color, I've added about 4 or 5 ounces of the clear paint base. I've added some white to lighten up the paint. I'm adding some blue and some black to this because we'll be painting cool blue. For most base colors, you'll need to add white as an opaquer. Without the opaquer, it'll become extremely dark color. The latex, now I use a batch of 350 airbrush. It's inexpensive and very easy to use. Okay, the way this works is air pressure comes out of the front. It pulls paint out of the paint tip, which pulls it out of the little jar. Okay, the farther the paint tip is out, the more spray you get. The wider the spray. The farther it is in, the finer the spray. This is a quart sprayer. This is what I would be using if I would be doing a large production run, if we're doing 15 or 20 masks. If you use a quart sprayer, you need a spray booth because of all the dust. You also need to wear a ventilator also. Okay, there I was just testing the paint spray. Now I'm going to paint it overall blue. Just build it up a little bit at a time. You can spray like maybe a 3-inch wide spray. You just need to keep moving the airbrush, okay, because if it creates puddles, that'll fill in your detail area. Okay, the mask is dry, so I'm going to be doing highlighting now. I've mixed the base color with a little bit of white. I've added some more clear base. About half ounce of the clear base, about a half ounce of the base color, and a little bit of white pigment. I'll be hitting all of the higher areas. You should possibly read Richard Corson's Stage Makeup to get a understanding of highlight and shadow first. Okay, this is an example of shading techniques. This is a dark blue paint that I've mixed with R&D 689E with just a little bit of blue and a little bit of black. This is showing the way you can build up the paint in layers. In other words, instead of doing like a cheekbone shadow with one large stroke, you can go in closer for one deep color, and then pull the airbrush back out for a hazing technique. That'll soften up the shadow and it won't be quite so harsh. In other words, you can control the width and the density of the color by adjusting the paint tip, or also by pushing the airbrush in closer for a finer, darker line, or pulling it back further for hazing. Here I'm hitting the shadow parts, and cheekbones, most of the wrinkles. This is also something that's very hard to teach. Basically, you need to get an airbrush and do a lot of practicing. The most commonly misdone thing when people start this type of thing is to try to do one bold shadow for everything. Like I mentioned before, it's best to go in close for a deeper shadow, then pull back to haze the shadow out and soften it up somewhat. I'm also hitting some little freckle or mole areas too, some little spots. Now I'm putting black around the teeth. This mask has red gums, and I shadowed the black around the teeth and the darkest parts of the gums, and I'll be painting red on top of that. The red has no white as no opaquer, so the black will show through very easily. The RD689E paint base, if you don't add an opaquer, it'll turn quite a bit darker. It'll also be fairly clear, too, so you can let underlying shadows show through. One bad thing about the R&D 689E paint base is that you have a limited time that you can use this. Once you start a mask, you basically have to have it completed within about 36 hours or so. If you wait longer than that, the fresh paint that you put on it will not dry. It will dry, but it will not bond to the underlying paint. What really happens is the base paint cures, and once it's totally cured, the fresh paint will not stick to it anymore. When it's fresh, it does. Okay, here I'm putting the red on top of the black. As you can see, the black is showing through just fine. This red looks darker in the video than it actually does in real life for some reason. We'll be airbrushing basically the entire mask, except for the horns, the teeth, and the pupils. Okay, so if you notice too, I've sprayed some blue over the lips. I'm also spraying red on top of that. But the combination of the two colors makes a purplish, and the darker blue in the cracks also has a shading. This is a layering technique. You can do quite a bit of this by combining two different colors overlapping. You can create a third color in varying densities. It's pretty effective. Spraying the eye yellow. This character has yellow eyes with green around the outside. Basically, this is the same thing as before, except for I'm getting much closer. I have a very fine line. You have to be very careful of overspraying doing a small area like this. Now I've got some green. This green also has very little opaquer added, so it'll dry quite a bit darker. So I need just a little bit of paint for the shading. I'm also shading up onto the eyelid just a tad, just to cover any overspray that may have occurred when I painted the eyes. The easiest way to do pupils for eyes is simply to get the back of a paintbrush that's flat and very round, dip the end of the brush into black paint, and apply it as a pupil. It's very easy and it works like a charm. Here on the gloss eyes, what I use is Jeff Keim 5-minute epoxy. It comes in two parts, a resin and a hardener. I add just a little bit of the resin, equal amount of the hardener. I mix it together with the back of my brush. Apply this to the eyes, and in 5 minutes you have a nice, hard, clear, glossy coat for the eyes. The easiest thing to do to get it off of a brush is a little jar of acetone. Acetone is very flammable, so do not smoke around it because it's very explosive. That will dissolve it off the brush. If you let it actually start to gel or start to harden, it will not dissolve it. But when it's still in its liquid state, it will. Cheese painting, we use rubber cement paint. To mix rubber cement paint, you need to add less than 20% pigment to raw rubber cement. In this case, we've added white pigment, a little bit of yellow, a little bit of black, a little bit of brown for this natural tooth color. We use naphtha as a thinner. The raw rubber cement is very thick and can't be brushed. We use maybe 3 to 4 parts naphtha to 1 part rubber cement. You can add extra pigment to the raw rubber cement. You cannot add pigment to the thin down rubber cement paint because it will not mix in. You can add less than 20% pigment. You simply need to have enough pigment in it where this tooth color is going to cover the black. Okay. If necessary, you can add a second coat over the top. If it's just a little bit see-through in places, you can add a second coat just fine. This technique is called a rub out. This is to be used on some heavily detailed characters. This mask I've sprayed with RD689E as a paint base and let it dry for 24 hours. Now I'm spraying it with rubber cement paint, tinted a dark brown overall. I shouldn't show you how to do rubber cement paint because it's extremely dangerous. Whether I show people or not, they're still going to use this stuff because they read about it. It's extremely dangerous. When you spray rubber cement paint, you get benzene in the air, and that's extremely hazardous to your health. If you do use rubber cement paint, please use it in a well-ventilated area and use a respirator. Again, it's very dangerous. Now the mask is basically an even coating of brown. I've added a little less sprayed on rubber cement paint over the less detailed areas like the big bulbous part of the forehead. I've taken some cloth swatches, a little jar of naphtha, and you dip the swatches in the naphtha and take the rubber cement off just like a stain. I use one swatch overall, take off as much as you can, pitch that, and grab a clean one, and continue to take off more rubber cement paint. The one thing that you have to watch out for is that if you rub too much, or if you go over one area too much, you're going to rub through your latex base color. And just basically continue cleaning this up, leaving the dark stuff in the cracks. If you use too thick of a material, like a sweatshirt material, you can basically take up all of the paint out of the cracks, which is not what you want to do. This is a very effective technique for some masks. It's pretty contrasty, though. You will need to go back in after the whole rub-out's done with more rubber cement paint and airbrush in some details. And I usually haze over the entire mask with a light coating of the detail paints. In this case, dark brown. That'll soften up the contrast. Otherwise, you end up with a very light base color and a very dark shadow. Okay, here I'm starting to airbrush some of those details in. I'm doing normal shading, and at the same time I'm softening up some of the contrast by pulling the airbrush back about a foot or so and hazing some areas. When you do the rub out, the naphtha also has fumes and should also be used in a well-ventilated area also. The reverse of this technique is called stippling, which I'll be showing next. In this case, instead of using rubber cement paint, you can use the RD689E paint base. You spray a mask black overall, then use a lighter base color, also in the RD689E. Get a small piece of sponge, dip it into the paint, and stipple the paint onto the top. You usually have to go over this 2 or 3 coats usually. Gives a similar technique to the rub out, but it's nowhere near as dangerous. And try to make your coat as even as possible. And like I said, you will need to go over it a second, possibly even a third time, possibly. And here's an example of the finished mask. Dead Ed to its left and Swamp Monster to its right is also done with stippling techniques. Okay, here I'm painting a pupil of an eye. I've already painted the eye white. Now I'm going in with the dark blue paint, and usually you can get by without painting the actual center of the eye. I simply use the same color that I'm doing for the iris and haze it over the center of the eye. If it's a blue eye, hazing some of the dark blue over the middle, and then doing the circle around the outside edge. This also takes a lot of practice. When you first start out, you probably have to paint irises over and over and over. Make a mistake, paint the eye white, and do it over again. After a while, it'll come real easy, but they're very hard to learn. Here I'm putting the pupil on. And it's done. This is Sue Bushner, and she's wearing a RIP2 mask. We use yak hair for most of our masks. It comes in one long continuous spool. You pull off hanks of about 6 inches in length, and you cut those flat before you actually apply them. She's pulling out hanks here. The way you do this is you grip the hair back from the end, like she is, holding on fairly firmly, and pulling on the end piece till it separates. The hair fibers are about are about that long. If you pull farther back, you'll get a very long hank. The hairs are kind of intertwined. When you comb the mask out, when you're finished, half the hair will come out if you try to glue on too long of hairs. Now she's using a Clairol applicator bottle that we filled with natural mask latex. She's applying a bead of the latex in a line. If you look closely, you can see that she's pinned on the different rows. Okay, now she'll get some of the hair and she'll cut off the ends to where it's flat so we can glue it. Now you press that flat edge against the latex, and we usually use the back of a brush and roll roll the brush against the hair so that the latex soaks up into the hair for a really good bond. It may look sloppy, but it makes a really good bond, and you won't see this when the hair job is finished. Overlaying layers are going to cover that. It's also possible to use contact cement or rubber cement for hair jobs also. We usually use latex for 90% of the hair jobs, and we use contact cement for some of the finished hairlines because it is clear and it doesn't show up as much. It's also much messier to work with also. It'll help if you're going to be doing very much hairing. It'll help to study wigs and also hair patterns of people because hair grows in several different directions. Depending on if the hair has a part, if it's going to be combed down, if it's going to be combed back, etc. There's several different kinds of hair available on the market. Camel hair, yak hair, herdwick. Yak hair is one of the best hairs because it consists mainly of a very dark brown hair with black hairs, some white hairs, some gray hairs mixed into it. So it has a lot of texture. It really shows up well. Like the camel hair is like a dyed brown yak hair. Excuse me, is a dyed brown hair. That is all. It's all one tone. There's no other colors mixed into it. Because of that, it looks very flat. It looks similar to fun fur. Now she's put some extra latex on top of the hair, and she's also rolling that on. If you don't put the second bead of latex on top, you may have a fairly good bond, but it may pull out with aggressive combing. The second layer makes for an excellent bond. Now she did have some latex dripped down onto the hair. When she's finished, she can go back in. She can cut out that little piece of latex. We space our layers about 2.5 to 3 inches apart. Sometimes more, sometimes less, basically depending on the hair job. This character here has bangs, so his basic outlay is semicircles in the back, and the top part of the head is basically set in large circles, stemming from the crown of the head. Okay, we're going to skip forward here in just a second because the whole thing will take about half hour to 45 minutes to do the hair job total. So Okay, this is the third layer. As you can see, the glue goes all the way around the front now. That hair she's going to be cutting quite a bit shorter. The hair in the front is going to be maybe half the length that the hair in the back would be. It's going to look real bushy to begin with. An awful lot of the hair is going to come out once the glue is dry. It's also possible to give the masks haircuts. Trim it down if it looks too shaggy also. If you want hair to go in a specific direction, instead of laying it on flat, you can cut the hair at an angle. Like if you want the hair to be parted, you can cut the hair at a 45-degree angle. Lay the bead of latex exactly like she did, but lay the hair at a 45-degree angle, having the cut meet it flat. It's also possible to use spray adhesives for herring also. There's a couple of mass companies in the market that do this. There's spray adhesives from 3M. You can find several at most hardware stores. The bad thing about the spray adhesives is that they aren't permanent. You spray the mask, you lay the hair on. It has a very nice hairline, but if you try to comb it out once, or if you grab it by the hair, boom, it's off. It's cheap. It looks good. It's cheap, but it's not permanent. Okay, this character's hair is just a little odd. Is just a little odd. Also, he has very large rotted areas, and when she's hairing it, she'll be leaving some of the rotted areas so that they show through. Now we've skipped ahead a little ways. She's got, I believe, a fourth layer on here. She's laying some latex right up next to some of those rotted areas. She's going to be putting on smaller hanks of hair right up against the rotted areas. If you want to, when a mask is finished like this, if you have an exposed area with latex as a glue, you can spray rubber cement paint over that, to turn the latex black, basically. It's also possible to put latex on and spread it out thinner, pat hair onto it, and it'll be very clear and translucent and won't show up at all. Okay, here where she's working at the crown of the head. She's got it just about done. And just a little bit more latex. As you can see, she's still overlapping it. When you're doing an area like this, it's best to V the hair out. If it's all straight, it may look choppy. Once hair is in place too, it's also possible to change the position of it. Once it's in place, you can move it up or sideways or whatever, just a little bit. You can't move it much, but you can reposition a little bit if it needs it. The hair really looks bushy at this point, but once it's combed out, it'll look just fine. Okay, now Sue's putting some thinning hair on the Elephant Man mask that I rubbed out earlier. Okay, she's put the glue on just like she did before, and basically applying it the same way, except for she's not putting extra glue on the top now. She's just putting the hair on the glue and tapping it in. Seeing this is very thinning hair, if extra hair comes out when it's being combed out, it doesn't matter. She's putting hair on in a pattern to where it's thinning hair, covering up some of these bulbous, diseased areas. If you have excess glue on the side when you're doing the hair, the way to make it invisible is simply just spread it out as thin as possible. In the thinned latex, it will dry so clear it won't show up. Oh, sorry if this part of the tape is a little boring, but it's really necessary to see a hair jump from beginning to end, so you know how to do it. And there's only so much I can say about it. Okay, now she's putting on some very thin wispy hair. She's added less latex, and she's rolling it out more. As you can see, the hair is a lot more see-through. Even though the latex glue shows up quite a bit on the video, when the glue is dried, it's going to be translucent, and it'll look just fine. As you can see, she's cut the hair, but she's kind of rotating it in her fingers, so it's not an even cut. So it actually looks like it's growing out of the head, very uneven instead of just a straight bit. It's also possible to punch hair in a mask also. If you're interested in that, check out Tom Savini's Bizarro, and I believe he shows how to do a hair punching needle in there. It's not as effective in mask latex as it is in foam latex because it's a little more evident that the hair is being punched in, but still, it can be done. One thing that's also important when you're laying hair, when you're rolling the brush on, if it's going to be a detail area like a hairline, just push down with enough pressure to where the glue soaks through a little bit, but don't constantly put the brush down and back up again, because that'll make the latex start to pull back up and make it look messy. Just tap it down with even pressure and just let it lie. Okay, now she's doing a hairline with contact cement. It'll dry clear. She's putting the bead on just like she did with the latex. The only difference here is that she's not going to be using a brush. She's not going to be rolling it down. She's going to cut the hair, shape it to match the bead that she's laid on, place the hair on top, and she's going to lightly pat it. As I mentioned, this hair is supposed to be very thinning. It doesn't matter if a lot of this pulls out. You just tap it very lightly. If you press down too hard, the the contact cement is going to stick to your fingers and pull the hair up. Now Sue has a finished Death Guy mask that's dried for several hours, so it's ready to be combed out. Just using a normal styling brush, combing it down with firm strokes, and you can see quite a bit of hair is pulling out. That's to be expected. Even though she gets an awful lot of hair in the brush, plenty of hair stays. Those are just loose hairs that weren't interwoven enough. This is the corpse, so it's going to stay shaggy, so we're not going to bother giving this one a haircut. Now she's going to show an example of how well it's glued in. Called RD 2575 from R&D Latex in California. It's a flexible glazing compound that you can spray or brush over a mask. What this does is add gloss to an area while keeping it totally flexible still. The epoxy gloss is going to crack if it's severely bent. This 2575 can be bent and stretched, and it'll never crack. It does peel occasionally, but if it does peel, you can go over it with an extra coat. Here's some examples of the RD 2575. The mouth of wolf, the wounds on infected, the mouth and eyes on carnivore 3, the mouth and eyes on swamp monster, mouth and eyes on junkyard kid, and all the wounded stuff on dead Ed. It's pretty nice stuff. Sprays on, dries clear. If you put too heavy of a coat, it will turn a little milky though. When the mask is finished, you need to prep it for mailing. If it has a small neck, you need to cut the mask up the back as far as it needs to be and punch the top with a paper punch. That'll stop the cut from tearing when the person tries the mask on. Next, we need to get some unscented baby powder or talcum powder and powder the inside. I usually put a little bit in a bowl, dab a sponge into that, Put the sponge on the inside of the mask and spread it overall, making sure you don't get the powder out of the eyes, ears, nose, or mouth holes. It's best to use unscented baby powder if you use baby powder because some people are allergic to certain fragrances. Next, I put on a Death Studios care card. That's to explain the care and maintenance of the Death Studios mask. You apply those with a little punch gun that's available at most office supply stores. It's the same thing that attaches price tags on the clothing. And we need to bag it, and it's done. Store finished masks in bags away from direct sunlight. Direct sunlight causes the gloss that we use on the eyes to yellow. Something that I didn't stress strongly enough before is the importance of the master copy. You can make dozens or even hundreds of one-piece copy molds from it if necessary. After you take it out of a mold, wash it off with water to get any excess plaster dust off of it, and pack it full of either newspaper or plastic and position it naturally on a post. Sometimes you get buildup of the crystal clear spray on it also. You notice that the plastic spray has become thick and is starting to crack in places. If this happens, get some cloth swatches, dip it in acetone, and try to dissolve some of the excess crystal clear off. Well, that's all for now. If you have any questions or if anything on this tape was unclear, please call me at 219-362-4321 between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. Central Time. If you'd like to send me any photos of your work, my address is 431 Pine Lake Avenue, Port, Indiana, 46350. I'd love to see your work once you get started. Have fun.